Previously on Coco Town.
And then I'll just be sad. And nothing shows up. Drive 5, there'd be nothing. I'm gonna type B, nothing shows up. Drive 6, there'd be nothing. I'm gonna type C, nothing shows up. 0, there'd be nothing. It's hard to hold it up on. Virtual floppies blank. Picture quality is terrible. And there we go. It's up and running. 35 years ago. And we're gonna see what kind of fireworks we get. You wanna do something like this. So I do that. Boom. Ha ha. We'll see. Let's see. Oh, by the way, I failed. But this has gone on long enough. In part 1, I showed how I took my physical Coco floppies and I used Drivewire to transfer them into my PC. And if you did that, you now have a big bloated hard drive file, maybe a bunch of them, and you've got a bunch of floppies kind of nested inside here. And if you wanted to, say, use an emulator with this, you would have to run Drivewire all the time so that Drivewire could do the translation from this hard drive file to individual floppy drives. And I personally, for my own taste, didn't want that dependency. What I wanted to do is to take these big hard drive files and then split them up into a bunch of virtual floppy files. Then I could run an emulator like XRoar. It would directly load those virtual floppy files, and I wouldn't need to use Drivewire at all for that. Also, remember, we're wasting space. We're wasting drives 0, 1, 2, and 3 for each of these files because of the conflict between the numbering. So I would just find it more convenient to have individual floppy disk files. So that's what we're going to talk about today. First up, we're going to need to run Drivewire 4 because Drivewire 4 has the ability to connect to emulators, and we're going to be using the XRoar emulator to do this splitting. You can configure Drivewire 4 using this XML file. You don't have to do what I'm about to show you, but I found it useful to be able to switch between different instances. One instance where you would connect via TCP, and one instance where you would connect via the COM port, via the serial port. So what I did is I just took the existing instance element, like from here on down to the ending tag, and I made a copy of it up here. And everything is the same. The only difference is that I changed the name to show that I'm connecting to my Coco, my physical Coco on COM3, and that I want to use the serial device for that instance. So I just changed the name and I changed the device I'm using. So this way I can use this instance whenever I want to use my physical Coco, and then I can use the instance that was already there, the TCP connection via TCP, whenever I want to use XRoar. This is the instance we're going to be caring about. This is the instance that uses the Becker port. So the Becker port is just like a virtual serial port. It's a port that some emulators are aware of, such as XRoar, and basically every time you try to go out through the emulated Coco serial port, it'll instead go through this Becker port, which is just a TCP address that it will connect to. So that's the instance that I'm going to be using. Again, you don't have to do this if you don't want to be switching back and forth between TCP and serial. Instead, you could just use the user interface of Drivewire 4 to just say, no, I want to use TCP. But we're going to be using TCP today, so I can connect to it through the Becker port. I made a batch file for running XRoar so I could be really explicit about all the things that I want to configure it to do. So I'm actually going to walk through some of these options that I'm passing to the XRoar executable. Some of the slightly uninteresting ones are I'm using the US Coco machine. I'm using the ROM for basic 1.4. I'm using the ROM for extended basic 1.1. Where it gets interesting is I'm going to ask it to use the Becker port. So I'm going to make it look like I'm using a Becker port cartridge, and I'm going to use this as my cartridge ROM. This is kind of the equivalent of what you saw in part 1 of the video where I loaded that HDB DOS WAV file into the Coco. This is like make believe there was a cartridge with that ROM, and make believe that was plugged into the XRoar emulator, and then it will automatically have all of the HDB DOS available. Then I have to configure it to tell it what IP address to use for the Becker port. 127.0.0.1 is the universal port that means me, localhost, same computer. And then I have to tell it which port I'm going to be using, in this case 650504. And then the rest is normal stuff, 64K of RAM, keyboard, blah, 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 blah. So that's how I'm going to be running my XRoar. First, let's get Drivewire 4 up and running, so XRoar will have something to connect to when it's ready. Alright, here's my Drivewire 4. I want to make sure that I am using TCP/IP, so I'm going to use this as my instance, bloop. And you'll see it's already configured to load my hard drive file here that I already have set up, so it should be ready to go. And I'm going to run XRoar using this command line. Okay, I'm going to make it a little bigger. You can see the quality is a lot better since I'm using an emulator that's not going through a crazy RF modulator like the physical Coco is. So if everything is working okay, I should now have, oh my goodness, what is going on here? I should now have my XRoar on the left connected to my Drivewire 4 on the right. So let's see what happens if I do a dir. It should go to Drivewire, and sure enough there's nothing on drive 0 or 1. But if I go up to 4, that has the stuff I copied. If I go up to 5, that has the backup that I tried that failed. If I go up to 6, that has the single file copy that worked. So this is looking pretty good so far. So what I'd like to do is take this, drive 4, and make a virtual floppy file just for this. Then I'd be able to connect to this with an emulator without even needing Drivewire. So the first thing I need to do is to make myself an empty floppy. So I'm going to use my command prompt to make an empty floppy. I'm here in my disk directory where I have my virtual hard drive. So I'm going to make a virtual floppy pretty much the same way that I made my virtual hard drive file. This is the command I'm going to need. I have it here in my little helper notepad file because I can't remember anything. In this case, we're not making a virtual hard drive file, so those other options that you saw last time are unnecessary. So I can just do this. And now I've got my Games 1 disk ready to go. And I'm going to load that Games 1 disk into my XRoar. So if I go into XRoar, I can say I want drive 1. By the way, drive 1 through 4 is how they number it in the UI. What they really mean is drive 0, drive 1, drive 2, drive 3. I'm not sure why this numbering is different from the numbering you would use when you type in commands. So I'll load up my Games 1 disk here. And I'm going to do drive off. And that means when I do dir 0, I'm looking at the virtual floppy that's directly connected to XRoar. And when I do anything at 4 or bigger, then I'm looking at whatever the Drivewire is hosting for me. Let's get this out of the way. So now I can do my backup from Drivewire, drive 4, to my virtual floppy that's directly connected to XRoar. And it's done. So I can verify that my drive 0 now has everything that drive 4 had. So I then repeat this process. I can go ahead and make another virtual floppy file and back up another virtual floppy from Drivewire hard drive to that virtual floppy file, and just keep on going on, and then I'll end up with a bunch of small virtual floppies. So let's take a look at what that looks like after all that process is finished. Alright, I've repeated that process a bunch of times, and now I have a bunch of these small virtual floppy files. So now what we're going to do is run XRoar without using Drivewire at all. So this was the command line I was using before, where it was using the Becker port, and it was using the Drivewire, the HDB DOS ROM. Now what I'm going to do is just directly use regular old basic, regular old extended basic, and I'm going to have my disk basic as the cartridge. No Becker port, no HDB DOS. So I'm going to get rid of that, and then I'm going to run this, and let's see what we get. Alright, let's make that a little bit bigger. Now you see it's just regular disk extended color basic. There's no HDB DOS going on here at all. So why don't I go ahead and try loading one of those into drive 0. Let's try games 4. Now if I do a dirt, there we are. If you notice that it's pausing for me rather than scrolling crazy, that's because I'm using version 1.2. It's like an updated version of the disk DOS. So now I can use these directly. I'm not running Drivewire, and I can have things named. Like with these names here, these aren't the most descriptive names, I guess, but I can at least differentiate between where the games are, where the other types of things are, and then I just load them as I need them rather than relying on these big bloated hard drive files. But that's just a total personal choice. You may not wish to do that. Before I go, I wanted to point something out. You might be wondering, why did I use Drivewire 4 with XRoar, but Drivewire 3 with my physical Coco? Why not just use Drivewire 4 with everything? So a picture's worth 1,000 words, so I'm just going to show you what happens when I try to use Drivewire 4 with my physical Coco. Okay, I have Drivewire 4 back up and running, and since it's easy enough to toggle between instances, now I can use this other instance that I added, where COM3 will be communicating with the Coco 2. Right now I don't have a disk in there yet, but we can fix that. Let's just double click this, yes. Just add games disk there. So the games is ready to go. And I'm just going to flick the switch on my Coco. Keep your eye on the screen, let's see what happens. Before the Coco even shows its startup screen, Drivewire just disappears. Well, maybe that's just like something weird about turning on the Coco, right? I bet it won't happen again. So let's go and rerun Drivewire 4. And it seems to be back as it used to be. There we go, we're connected to the Coco 2. And so what I'm going to do here is load my Drivewire code into the Coco. Alright, so I'm going to load on my Drivewire file. And let's run it. Oh, it disappeared again! Ah! Alright, well I'm sure it won't happen again. I'm just going to run Drivewire 4 again. Double check. Instance, it's connected. The little disk is ready to go, so let's just try that out. We'll do a dir. Oh! Alright, so what's been happening is there's a support DLL in Drivewire 4 for serial port support, and it always crashes inside that DLL for some reason. There's some kind of unexpected, I don't know, bits going back and forth on the serial port. Don't know why, did not really investigate. I just said, well, let's see if Drivewire 3 works, and it does. So that's kind of where I left it. Don't know what was going on there. But anyway, that's why, if you were curious, I was using Drivewire 3 with Coco. It's because it doesn't crash. Anyway, I hope you got something out of this today, and I'll see you next time.